Hello, tank fans, and welcome back to the Totally Tanked podcast, episode 8. It is the 9th of March, 2020. My name is John, and I'm joined in the pod by Rob.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rob. We're going to talk about tanks. What tanks are we going to talk about, John?
We're going to break with the whole concept of this podcast.
We have a concept?
It's done. We are going to talk about World War I tanks, or First World War armour. And the reason we're going to do it that way is that there is a variety of slightly interesting tanks and no singularly interesting tank in World War One.
Oh, good, yeah.
Yeah, so instead of, Renault FT kind of, sort of, but even then not really. That's why we're just going to talk about tanks. And this is the origin story of the tank.
It is. All 5 types or whatever you want to, maybe 10? I don't know. There's a couple. Not many, but this was the beginning of it all.
This was the dawn of the tank. And also, the use of tanks in World War One is often misunderstood, and quite a lot about World War One is also often misunderstood. And for that, I blame the poets. In all seriousness, the war poets, a whole lot of quite good English poets were called up to serve in the war, which they did with distinction, and then they wrote a lot of poetry about the war based on their perceptions as junior lieutenants and privates.
And seeing everybody die around them in the trenches.
Yeah, which is interesting and valid, but not a good strategic overview of why things happened as much as what. They definitely had the what right.
Yep. They saw the consequences of decisions. They didn't understand why those decisions were being made, though.
Yeah, which wasn't their job either. But
No.
I think that's led to a lot of the misunderstandings that do surround the war that we're going to address in part through the lens of the tank, the vehicle of the tank, as it were.
Yes. So going into the war, everybody thought it'll all be marching up and down in squares of infantry formations and cavalry charges left, right, and centre. And then suddenly the Germans came out with a bunch of great big machine guns, and then suddenly that poetic idea disappeared very quickly. And then trenches and barbed wire and artillery barrages came along, and everybody said, "Oh, it sucks." Yeah.
Now, I would say that what you've described is a popular view, and the reality is that military professionals had looked at what happened in the U.S. Civil War, where defensive works had
that's the professionals,
sieges made up a large.
Remember, a lot of the people fighting these wars were volunteers.
Oh yeah. Down at and certainly the public all thought, oh, we'll be marching through each other's capitals by Christmas.
Yep.
Which was a wishful.
That's the way it had been done 50 years ago. And
the Franco-Prussian War had a quite significant siege of Paris, and quite a lot of early machine guns and all those sorts of things.
But basically, we ended up with a lot of trenches, a lot of barbed wire, and everybody said, "Oh, I don't like walking out there. How can I go get across the other side of this no man's land without getting killed?" And breaking all the barbed wire and crossing the trenches and everything else. And that's where they came up with the concept of
the tank,
the land ship.
Ah, well, yes. And let's also understand a little bit the geography of northern France, where it's thick soil,
mud,
which turns into mud very easily. It rains a lot, and you put a couple of million men facing each other over that and fighting over it. I mean, you look at a wet rugby pitch when 15 guys have spent a couple of hours fighting over it. There's not a lot of grass left on that, and an actual war is a far more significant undertaking. So there's a lot of mud. There's a lot of holes in the mud. There's a lot more concrete than people give credit for, particularly when you're trying to attack German positions, which tended to be very intricate and heavily concreted in. Germans tended to keep their troops in the line for much longer periods of time, which is partly why they had to have better provisions for them, whereas Allied troops tended to not spend more than a couple of weeks actually in a particular trench.
The main thing is, from all this, that they decided that something needed to be done to be able to cross that no man's land, break the barbed wire and cross the trenches and break through the other side, because cavalry charges weren't working anymore.
Now, if it's armour, we have to talk about the green fields beyond, don't we?
Yes.
Because the Armoured Corps flag, at least in the British Armoured Corps flag, the Australian one I'm sure is the same, where it's the yellow and red for the mud and the blood, and then a green stripe for the green fields beyond.
That's quite possible. They've just got a tank on their badges.
Okay. So, 1915, the Western European theatre is largely settled down to stalemate, which the troops were quite happy with, and the High Command were decidedly not happy with, because it was costing literally all the money in the world to keep troops in the field in their millions, and you expect them to be doing something. Now, tractors with caterpillar tracks did exist prior to the war.
Hornsby tractor.
Hornsby tractor and the Holt tractor as well. There are a few.
And they were heavily employed during the war for towing around in gun carriages, because horses, as you want bigger and bigger guns, for artillery pieces we're talking here, horses can no longer drag them through the mud, whereas your decent gun tractor can still pull it along the mud, through the mud, and get it to the position there where you want it to get it to. Yeah,
there's a concept called ground pressure, which I don't think we've tackled well on this podcast yet. Which
we haven't.
Is part of industrial warfare and really important one, and also
as soon as you start putting more weight on things, if you only got wheels, the wheels will sink, because you only got your ground pressure is only in one little spot, whereas once you've got a track,
or lots of bigger wheels if you can afford, and can figure out how to give them multiple drivetrains, which in 1914
they couldn't, because
they barely had differentials.
It just added more weight. As soon as you do multiple drivetrains, all you're doing is adding more weight, in which case it counteracts the ability to spread out the load. So with your tracks, they suddenly tracks, and one, they had extra power from the steam engines, essentially, and then the internal combustion engines they were using, and then they could spread it out over a much longer distance, and so you could actually drive over rough terrain and not sink into the mud. Whereas wheels and armoured cars were being used around the place, and were very effective in dry places where ground pressure didn't matter.
Or just zooming up and down roads is a big part of the armoured car's appeal up until that point. And it's worth bearing in mind that trains had dominated warfare for, let's say, the century beforehand.
Yep.
And would continue to be unbelievably important. I mean, you can track German advances in World War II by their distances from the railheads.
And the reason why the Allies invaded through Sicily and Italy, because the trains didn't run from Germany to Italy very well. And they said, well, this is a weakness for the continental Nazis, so
So trains were unbelievably important, and the limitations of trains will also dictate the evolution of the tank as this story goes on. So an understanding of trains also becomes quite important, or at least thinking in terms of trains. But there were armoured trains, and what an era of warfare that was, when the mighty armoured trains rumbled up and down the tracks, carrying really big guns in sponson mounts and weird turrets, and it was a glorious time to be alive.
if you're a trained person, but we're tank people, and we're talking about land ships.
My point is, the concepts to build the land ship all did exist, which is part of the reason it could be developed so quickly. Because just things like caterpillar tracks are very complicated things that you're not going to develop from scratch in a year.
No,
that had to be there as a concept,
and which is why both the British and the French came up with this idea of a tank pretty much at the same time. So it wasn't. It's like the radio. It's just that it was cometh the time they came up with the idea. So. And the reason they were calling it land ships, because they were looking at it and saying, "Yep, we're taking a great big gun, giving it some armor, and we're going to drive it across the land." You know what? That's a ship on land.
Also, H.G. Wells had a story called The Land Ships, published in, I think, 1905.
There you go.
His land ships were like hundreds of meters of long, with bristling with 20 or 30 guns, a bit like the French dreadnoughts of the 1890s. You know, when hotels go to war. But on track. So the concept had existed, and suddenly there was the place that was needed, because you had contested ground, heavily defended ground, that troops couldn't move quickly across, and so some way of protecting a payload while you moved it across this no man's land and could then assault the enemy positions became increasingly imperative.
But they couldn't call them land ships, because as soon as they called them land ships, everybody would know exactly what they were talking about, so they had to come up with a code name. And so they told the factory workers in England that they're building water tanks. Or that was the name they were using. And so that's where we get the name tank from.
It is. Now, there's an important point here, which is most people born in the last 100 years, a water tank is a round thing. And you look at it and you go, that doesn't look anything like a tank. But if you go back to the early 1900s, tanks were made out of straight iron plates and riveted at the corners.
Yep.
So a water tank circa 1915 was a square riveted iron box. So to them, what was called the tank looked a lot like a water tank of that time. And I found when I made that little breakthrough in my mind, it suddenly all made a lot more sense.
Right. I'm just thinking it's a great big thing made of metal so that you're,
put
whether
things
it's
in it.
square and
It's a tank.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's where we got the name water tank. They they were disguising the factory workers were calling them water tanks, and the name just sort of stuck from there. And it got used in official correspondence because they were saying, yep, we're shipping these tanks from England to France.
And everyone thought, ho, 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 we're so clever, we're just writing tanks. The Germans will never know that it's land dreadnoughts.
And of course, the Germans talk about tanks from the First World War as tanks, but the actual word in German is Panzer. So, which is why...
Isn't it Panzer Schwarzkampf or something like that? I mean, Panzer just means armoured.
Yeah. All that sort of stuff, probably. Yeah. But
the Russians say, you know what's a good name for a tank? Tank.
But the Germans still call their First World War tanks as tanks rather than Panzer, various versions.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Now, so the first tank, Little Willie, started running in around 1915.
Yes, there are a lot of concepts coming up. So the British, there was, of the two nations who were trying to build this stuff, there was the British and the French. The British went with one big committee and said, right, nothing will happen without the committee's approval. We'll do it, and we'll all come up with one unified way. The French said, yeah, we're just going to let everybody go out and build their own and see which one works best. And once we figure that out, we'll build lots of those.
Yeah, and it's worth noting with the British. Now, we're going to talk about Winston Churchill for a little bit, a controversial figure, some might say. In the diaries of Alan Brooke, who was the Chief of General Staff in World War II, he noted, Winston has 11 really bad ideas every day, and it's my job to make sure they never come to anything.
Yep, I remember that one.
And then he noted...
I read that one.
And then he noted... But that 12th idea every day is often a really good one.
Yeah, the plans for Norway and the plans for the Canadians going into France. All those bad ideas, but...
Bangladeshi famine.
Yeah. Dardanelles, yeah.
Now, no one is claiming Winston Churchill invented the tank, but what Winston Churchill did do when he was in a position in government to influence things...
First order of the Admiralty. So, yes. Again, a Navy position.
Navy position and a Navy concept, but he... and remember, he was an experienced soldier before World War I, and he did also serve on the front lines in World War I. When he resigned his commission after resigned his ministry after the Dardanelles fiasco. Another bad idea of Winston's worth noting. In between, he did lay the keels for the Queen Elizabeth class battleships, which would literally save the Royal Navy's day in both World Wars, at the Battle of Jutland and throughout World War II. And he also pushed through and kept moving the concept of the tank or the land ship so it would exist. And I'm just going to read David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, dated 19th September 1916. It is really to Mr. Winston Churchill that the credit is due more than to anyone else. He took up with enthusiasm the idea of making them a long time ago, and he met with many difficulties. He converted me, and at the Ministry of Munitions he went ahead and made them. So there you go. The tank, the brainchild of Winston Churchill. But where did we go from there?
Well, the French, as I said, they had multiple ideas, and they came up with one big heavy tank, the Cav something like Cambra. I don't know. It was a name. I didn't really stick in my head, but
they have a Schneider company making a bunch of light tanks for them as well.
Yep, but the main one they came up with was the Renault FT17.
Oh, you're jumping ahead.
Oh, am I?
Didn't see service till 1917.
No, but they came up with a number of different tanks, and eventually they figured out which one they were going to go for. So. There
is suspicion with Renault because they were approached by the French government who said, we want you to make these things that the British are calling tanks. And Renault said, we're too busy, we're not interested. And then a couple of years later, they asked again, you sure you don't want to try making these tank things? And they were like, aha, here is the the concept perfected.
They were also making armoured cars at that stage.
They were. But to go back a little bit, the British succeeded in building the Mother series of tanks.
The 120 horsepower.
The thought of trying to drive anything with 120 horsepower.
Yep. They said their goal was something that could go at 4 miles an hour, full speed ahead.
Well, why would you want to go faster than the infantry can walk?
Exactly. But a lot of the time it only went at 1. But that's not.
But the point was they made them. They had, as I'm sure most of our listeners know, the male and the female tanks, where the male had 2 big guns and a bunch of machine guns, and the females had lots of machine guns.
And one slightly bigger machine gun.
Yeah, but fundamentally the females were lots of machine guns and the males had bigger cannon on them was the concept. These were, now part of the distinctive shape of British World War I armour is these rhomboid-shaped tracks that go all the way around the outside. And one thing they were really, really good at was if you put anti-ditching logs on the outside of the tracks, it could go completely around the outside, so you didn't have to keep attaching the log and removing the log like you do on a
modern tank.
A modern tank.
Well, any sort of tank after that one.
Yeah. So in terms of getting stuck in the mud and being able to unditch yourself, remembering these are the first tanks, there are no tank recovery vehicles.
No. So we're starting out with the Mark 1 here, basically, is what we're talking about. And then, of which there were 150 made.
Which is quite a lot, really.
Yeah.
Particularly when no one had any idea how to use them or what they were going to do. Or they were going to crawl slowly across northern France towards German lines. I guess that was the concept. There was a memorable, and this goes to the demise of this distinctive track design, memorable incident when the king came to review what they were up to, and they tried to show off with how fast it could go and diving over bumps and catching air and all those exciting things, and pulled to a stop in front of the king, and of the crew of 8, only 3 stumbled out to surrender because the other 5 had been knocked out cold.
Yes. They were not fun things. So they did have a crew of 8, as you say, 4 to drive and 4 to man the guns.
Each of the gearboxes on each of the tracks required its own operator, which required being yelled at as to what gear they were attempting to shift into. So a lot of things got automated very quickly as the tank developed, but that was the only thing. I have been inside, I think it was a Mark 9, because it was so big, because it was intended basically as an early personnel carrier.
Yep.
But the same basic concept. And they are quite boxy and roomy inside until you fit 8 people into it. But they're just horrifying in terms of the engine is just exposed in the middle of the thing, and so you're getting
carbon monoxide, the cordite, the petrol.
Every time they fired anything, they're filled up with fumes. The heat, apparently the heat was well over 60 degrees centigrade inside, so everyone was basically naked and sweating. And part of the problem being naked was that you had this exposed engine, there was no suspension, nothing to hang on to. People kept falling on the engine and burning themselves. People kept smacking their heads into things and passing out. It was better still than walking across the no man's land, but not entirely pleasant. And they were learning all sorts of things like spalling. So someone shoots his Mauser at your tank with its
8 millimeters of armour.
Yeah, with its 8 millimeters of armour. The armour might stop. It's doing quite well to stop a Mauser round, quite frankly. Even if it does, that doesn't mean lots of fragments of your armour aren't now flying around the inside of the tank.
We're hitting your exposed flesh, in which case they had to come up with their own little armoured face visors of chainmail that they wear inside the tank.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
I'm assuming only in winter, though.
when you could be wearing more gear, yeah. Which, winter was not a famed fighting season. They tended to retreat to their bunkers for most of the winters, but... So this is giving 8 cents. Now, where did the tank finally make its debut?
At the Battle of the Somme. Now, 1st to the 18th of July 1916, the British employed... I didn't write it down. Probably
about 30 odd.
No, it was more than that.
Sorry, I'm talking the number that actually were running on the day.
Yeah, quite possibly. They employed a number of tanks, but not an overwhelming number. It was just basically they. General Haig had them at his disposal, and they said, "We're going all in on this bet," and said rather than waiting until they had a overwhelming number or anything else. And at this stage, the Germans didn't know they had the tanks.
And also, I mean, things that in a perfect world you could do, like train the infantry to operate with the tanks, figure out the logistic, how you're going to resupply them once they get forward.
They just threw them in and said, see how you go, boys. And they gave them a sport role. And the Battle of the Somme is the Battle of the Somme, and everybody's...
The tanks did actually achieve major breakthroughs. The problem was they weren't supported because no one knew what the hell was going on. Where's that thing? What is it going?
And the Germans had... And nobody had any doctrine. Nobody had any process. They didn't know how to work with these things. They didn't know how to communicate with them. There was a lot of mechanical issues, and so that they would break down or they get stuck in the ditches or the shell craters. It wasn't a huge success, but as you were saying before...
Well, there's a couple of things about the Battle of the Somme that are poorly understood. And again, it's easy to blame the poets, but not just them. The Somme was a dreadful bloodbath. And if you were starting a war saying, I know, let's have a battle where we just pour millions of men in on either side and everyone dies and no one achieves anything, you'd say, no, thank you. That's not a plan we're signing up to. But you've got to take the context of the conflict at that time, which was that the Germans were trying to bleed the French dry at the Battle of Verdun. The French army was on the verge of mutiny. The Germans were about to win the war, and Field Marshal Haig felt he had to attack with everything he had, even though it wasn't ready, even though they desperately wanted to be making this attack in a year later in 1917, when the new troops had had time for better training, better doctrine, all of those things. That wasn't a luxury available to them. If they didn't attack when they attacked at the Somme, the Germans would have won the war. Now...
Could they have done it better? Yes, they could.
I don't know, honestly, if anyone could have done it better, given the context that they faced. And if the Somme was, the dreary arithmetic of attrition warfare is not a good place to be. But for an attacking force to be dealing pretty parity casualties to entrenched defenders is not a miserable failure.
No, but part of the German doctrine, of course, was let the stupid Tommies attack, let them take these lines, and you know what? Once they're stretched out of order and everything else, then we come and roll in with our counterattack and push and wipe them all out, which was... The Germans had said, this is part of our doctrine. We've got fewer people. We've got longer lines of supply back to Germany, even though they're better through their rail lines. But they'd figured out the doctrine. They'd actually thought about how we know it. Fall back and then overwhelm them once again. Yeah. So it was...
it's worth noting German defensive doctrine morphed and changed quite significantly through the course of World War One as... the attacking doctrine of the Allies changed. So you can't say there was one doctrine for the whole war.
But they were I think
they put a lot of thought into it, and they were very good at it.
Yeah, exactly. Where they were punching above their weights, to my mind, with the thought they put in to how they were going to actually fight this battle, fight this battle. And it was just... But then again, it came along the tanks, and this. Should we go on to the Battle of Cambria?
No, look, I think we'll just take a little pause, but I would just note with the Somme that the tanks did succeed within the context of the Somme, in that the Germans were shocked by the appearance of these machines and poured in enormous resources to stop their advance, which basically meant bring in lots of artillery and keep shooting till you hit the damn things.
So basically, they had to, logistics-wise, they had to move everything from one side of France to the other and suddenly shore up this battlefield so that they could win back the land and carry out a counterattack and stop these behemoth land ships.
And also the threat of the tank was something that the Germans then had to plan to counter throughout the war, even when there were no tanks to counter. So
you've still always got to have a think of, well, they've got this capability now, where are they next going to employ it? And
which, for a start, the Germans started building wider trenches.
There you go.
Because those early model tanks were the length they were to get over a standard German trench, and so the Germans had to dig their trenches 2 feet wider.
Which then allows more artillery to fall into the trench.
Less efficient as a trench, correct. Okay, Rob, Now tell us about the Battle of Cambria, which warms every tank man's heart. Well,
it
every
is. They
British
still,
Empire tankman's heart.
They still celebrate it, right? The Australian Armoured Corps still celebrates the Battle of Cambria. It was on the 20th of November 1917. This was 432 Mark IVs came rolling across the trenches towards the Germans. It was the first tank battle, tank use of tanks. And where the Armoured Corps says, yep, this is our moment. This is where we're stepping up and becoming a thing. So previous to this, tanks have been used as a support to an infantry attack. They had never been the leaders. They had never been part of the main thrust. They were just there, and they were there to do their thing. This time, 432 tanks rolled out across the battlefield and said, we're in charge and we're going to do this thing.
And it's an interesting one because, yes, on one level, the Germans are like, well, the British have these tanks, but if we mass our artillery, we can hit the lone tank. But when there's 400. A wave of 400 of the damn things, you don't have the artillery available to mass on any given one, and it becomes extremely complicated.
You do, but it's much harder for them. I mean,
I bet you they didn't have enough telephone circuits to register the
fire
control.
I was about to say, that's probably the big thing with that. That's why these tanks could go at 4 miles an hour, is that the communications in both directions was, well, we need to get artillery fire in this area because there's a lot of slow-moving targets, which was highly susceptible to artillery and mortar fire. But if you don't have the comms back to from your front lines back to your battalion or regimental artillery or divisional artillery or whatever else, then you can't call that fire in.
Yeah, and I mean, a tank is a difficult problem for an artillery piece, even a modern artillery piece. It's not an insoluble problem, but it's a difficult one. I mean, German artillery by certainly early 1918 was entirely capable of hitting a crossroad at significant distance, which is crossroad is basically a tank-sized object when you think about it.
Yes.
But that was a pre-registered crossroad, not a there's a tank over there. That's where it gets to be the difficult solution of figuring out exactly how to
when
hit
you're
it.
calling in divisional artillery, that's a lot of arty. That's coming down.
Particularly in World War I divisional artillery, yeah.
You're calling in a lot of stuff. But anyway, so
You still have to have it landing in roughly the right spot, otherwise you're just bouncing mud.
Yeah, it's a lot of targets, though. For these slow-moving targets going across, it'd just be getting the word back through the lines. And they are moving. And when the lines are only 400 metres apart, it doesn't take them that long to cross that 400 metres. And suddenly, yep, where the hell these things come out of the dawn? And
also, by 17, I think you're talking about tanks that are now up in the 8 miles an hour range, which is still slow for tanks, but you know,
I think you're pushing it there. All right, so they made the breakthrough. They've hit the German lines. They've pushed through the German lines. The infantry's come with them. They're very successful. They've beaten off the counterattacks, which is the big part of it. Mm-hmm. All right. So as I said before, the Germans would always pull back, let the British and the French stretch their lines, and then come through as a counterattack and push them out again. But this time, the tanks would be essential to defending against the counterattacks. They were providing that mobile firepower to stop the Germans coming back in. And 2 weeks later, it still all fell apart, and they had to retreat back.
That's not the tank's fault, though.
It wasn't the tank's fault. It was the first time they were used successfully to carry out a breakthrough activity, but because it was the first time, nobody knew what to do after that. That's where you really wanted either your armoured cars or your cavalry to be running around the backside of the enemy lines and saying, "How about you, Johnny Smith," whatever. And they didn't have that breakthrough force. So the tanks could only go, yep, we've broken the line. Now what do we do?
Yeah, figuring out the logistics on the breakthrough forces was always a tricky thing because, as we mentioned, there was more artillery than the Eastern Front in 1945. I guess there was more artillery, but pretty much more artillery than the world had. It's certainly seen up until that point in the neighbourhood, making life miserable for anyone trying to move. Okay, so that's Cambria, which I think brings us to...
Beer review.
Beer review. Now, this is...
Hang on. Just let me...
You want to do the joke?
I just want to do my joke. So, like love in the time of cholera, we are drinking Corona in the time of tanks.
Tanks in a time of Corona, even. So, COVID-19, which, if you want to make your life a little brighter, every time you see COVID-19 written, just think in your head like it's Common Eileen from the song. COVID-19. Yeah.
Nice. I like that. I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah.
So I was out this morning. I said, right, what are we going to have tonight? This afternoon, we're going to have a Corona because why the hell not?
Now, we have no lime. I'm sure you've all seen the jokes of, man with Corona sees woman with lime.
No, I haven't.
You're really living under a rock these days, aren't you? Okay, so Corona Extra, Mexico's most famous export. I believe it's owned by AB InBev these days. I should say somewhere on here. No, just Corona.com.
La Cerveza Más Fina.
Mm-hmm.
The cerveza of Mexico. Look, it's Corona. Everybody's had it. If you drink a beer, you've probably had it at some stage in life. I didn't realise there was the Corona Extra and the Corona Liga were the difference. So you actually have there was a mid-strength in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, in America they view Corona as a light beer, which, given the pretty light standard of a lot of
American beers,
well, domestic beers. I mean, the American craft beer scene is. Look, this is a famous, well-loved beer worldwide because it is a very tasty lager.
It is. It's
nice on a hot day. It's clear. It's fizzy.
And while today started out cool, it has now become hot, so it's going down very nicely.
Yeah, particularly as we can't run fans in the pod to spare your delicate ears, listener, from the fan noise. Corona Extra, and this is the 4.5% version.
Yep.
You know what? I don't care about the jokes. I don't care that I don't have the lime. On its own, if a little craft brewery made this and sold it, everyone would say, wow, they're amazing. That's really good. It's solid in its own...
What is the creature on the label, do you think? Is it a lion or a
phoenix? Looks kind of like Toothless to me.
No, hang on. I'm going to say it's
a Night Stalker, isn't it?
Ooh, but with the
funny wings.
Funny wings. I'm going to say Manticore, maybe?
It does have a little spike on the end, which puts into Manticore territory.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's Manticore.
Yeah, wow. A beer with Manticores on it. Never thought about that or noticed. But,
no.
that's why we keep you around, isn't it? Okay, let's move on. The British weren't the only people to have tanks. Far from it.
No, the Germans said, we got to do something about this, and they built 20.
Funny thing, they built 20 of what became known as the A7s, which I think had a crew of 12 and could have been run with a steam engine.
Slightly thicker armour as well. So basically, there was a bunker on with tracks, and the tracks were enclosed.
Yeah, which had some merits, but certainly made unditching miserable.
But basically, they said, we're not going to bother with this thing. But the guys at the front said, all these bloody British tanks running over the top of us, and when they break down and the British run away, we can make use of those. They ended up with 40
Mark IVs with iron crosses on the side.
Yeah. Captured British tanks, and they said, double their own number.
Now, but before we move on from the British tanks,
sorry, I was going to say that the thing that the German High Command did say, we have to do something about these tanks, rather than build tanks themselves. They said, right, everybody, here is bigger anti-tank weapons. Here are some anti-tank weapons to use against those tanks, and they were very effective.
Yeah, I mean, people mock the boys' rifle and things like that in the World War II context, but a large caliber rifle was entirely capable of going through the sides of tanks of this era. You didn't know if you'd hit anything. It kept rumbling on. There were 8 dudes inside, but you were doing damage. You were doing damage.
And there were the mechanics in mechanical movements in these things were not robust. It was they broke down all the freaking time. So one decent bullet through the side of it, and you don't know what you're going to hit, but you're probably going to hit something that's going to stop it going. Now,
I want to quickly resolve a mystery of British tanks of World War I that no one has thought of, but once they think of it, they'll think, how does that work? And I'll then provide the answer. As we've discussed, railways are unbelievably important to warfare of this era, and most tank design, certainly up until the 1960s, was still limited by the width of what you could transport on the back on a train.
Because it's much easier to put a tank on the back of a train and drive it somewhere on a train than drive the tank across, say, Australia.
Yeah, but also if it's a heavy tank, there's literally no truck that you can put it on, certainly in 1915, because, heavy low loaders were 50 years in the future. So width was unbelievably important. Why turret rings were the width they were on, World War II tanks was because if the turret ring was wider than a train tunnel, it wasn't going anywhere. And particularly when your tank only moves at 4 miles an hour, it really needs something else to get it to the battlefield. The British land ships, the Mark 1s through Mark 4s, even up to the Mark 9s, very wide with those sponsons. How do you think they made that work?
They took them off.
No, they were like pop-up caravans. The sponsons could actually be retracted into the tank. The tank was non-operable at that point because all the interior space was taken up with sponson and not with
people.
But that was they retracted like pop-up camper vans. So there you go. Again, when your armoured construction is,
I guess that's where you get your air portable tanks as well. The lightweight things that
like locusts and things like that.
Yeah, well, and the AMX-13, which we've spoken about before.
Sure.
Basically, you build them so that they can fit into things, and there might be a bit of retracting this and unbolting that, but yeah.
You certainly want to be able to get it all. I mean, anyone who's set up a pop-up caravan knows it's generally quicker to put up a tent than it is to unwind your caravan. But anyway, so that's how those super wide tanks of the First World War were still transported on trains. But the sorry, I was about to jump into the Renault FT, but we're not going there yet.
No, we're going with the Tsar Tank. Now, this is a tank I'd never heard of until John mentioned it.
I just said we have to mention the Tsar Tank.
The Tsar Tank is freaking bizarre, folks. Okay,
no, but
think of a tricycle. All right, you got to think of a tricycle. So you got
I'm thinking of a tricycle.
Right,
I've got it in my head.
You got two big wheels on this tricycle, so it's like a reverse tricycle.
A tadpole tricycle.
Yep, 2 big wheels at the front, 1 little wheel at the back. Now, when I say big wheels, I'm talking.
Think a penny farthing, okay? Yep. But a penny farthing tricycle.
Yeah, penny farthing tricycle, right?
With a 5-inch gun mounted up where the saddle would go.
9 meter wheels of your penny farthing.
Which is the Russians coming up with their own unique solution to the ground pressure problem.
Exactly.
That drove the track.
They had such a big wheel that they decreased the ground pressure to be able to roll this thing along. And a 9 meter high wheel, and then you had, as John was saying, a 5-inch gun based in it, and 2 other smaller guns out to the sides in little sponsons. Besides your rear wheel, providing the traction and
the steering,
the smallest rear wheel, and they built one. They took it out for testing, and it got stuck, and that was the end of that.
I think it's a shame because there are some problems with the concept in terms of it's quite a large target and visible from very great distances,
and spokes break really easily.
Spokes do break, but 1 or 2 spokes breaking isn't a problem, and if they're easily replaced, you've got some merit. Just because the Russians tried it once and it didn't work didn't mean the idea couldn't have been made to work, particularly if people who weren't Russians were trying to make it work. But anyway, it was a valiant attempt. It spawned, I think there was a tank in the second Star Wars prequel. I
was about to say, any sort of uni-wheel tank will have been inspired by this, because you're seeing a great big gun with surrounded by a great big wheel. Even though the turret was slightly to the rear of the great big wheels, it was, when you look at it, you say, "Yep, that is a uni-wheel with guns bolted onto it," and that's been in a lot of science fiction type stuff. Yeah. Whether it's Ray Bradbury or Star Wars or Heinlein, whoever else, they've put it out there, and you just go, "Yep," and you forget the rear wheel, and just say, "Great big wheel with a turret, right, with a gun mounted either on the
once
sides."
You've got, electronic controls and gyroscopic stabilizers, you don't need that rear wheel. But,
I'm driving around in Borderlands 3 of them.
Now, moving back to the German A7M, which, if we're going to talk Star Wars inspiration, the Jawas land ship has a lot of considerable nods to the German A7s.
I'll agree with that.
Now, the German A7 is notable, despite being a terrible tank in every other way that the Germans could basically not be bothered producing. They would rather loot British Mark IVs, and they did in much greater numbers than build A7s. It was involved in the first ever tank-on-tank battle of world history.
That's right. Villers-Bretonneux, on 24th of April 1918, 3 German A7Vs versus 3 Mark IVs, 2 females, 1 male, and it was totally inconclusive. Basically, everyone either got abandoned or ran away until there was 1 Mark IV left on the battlefield and said, well...
That constitutes victory in anyone's book.
Yeah, Villers-Bretonneux is very famous.
Wasn't that where Mephisto was captured?
Quite possibly. Mephisto being Mark
German A7M.
A7M at the Australian War Memorial.
No.
Oh, we've got rid of it? What?
No, it came to visit. So the A7M Mephisto was captured by the Australian troops, I believe, around...
Villers-Bretonneux being a very famous place for Australia, with lots of Australian troops fighting on there. And the A7M, very nice big flat sides, and so any photos you'll see of these vehicles will have a lot of Australian troops graffiti on the outside saying, I was here, Mum.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So Mephisto, I believe, was captured at this incident, or sometime around here, was transported back as a trophy to Queensland, and basically sat rusting at Brisbane Airport for the next nearly 100 years. And then got some restoration work and came to visit Cambra. It was here at the Australian War Memorial for about a year, but it's gone back to Queensland.
Right. Where in Queensland?
I don't know. There are a couple of major armour museums up around Townsville. But
I know.
I can't tell you where.
I was about to say the Tank Museum.
There's the museum.
There's a pucker.
There's the Museum of Australian Armour at Townsville, I think.
No, it's a pucker.
No, it's a new one.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
there you
after
go.
your time.
I was about to say 20 years ago. Yeah.
Anywho, Mephisto is no longer here in Canberra. We have had a listener get in touch with us wanting to know if he came to visit Canberra, if he could see the A7M, and I had to regretfully inform him that it's gone. But we do have a Mark IV and a Renault FT in the Australian War Memorial collection.
Now, before we go on to the Renault FT, we're going to talk about Lancelot Demol. Now, this was the Australian man. Mm-hmm. This was the Australian man in 1912 said, hey...
I've got a vision of the tank because I've just read H.G. Wells's The Land Ships.
Quite possibly. He's got a vision. And he said, who would like me to build one of these for the military? And then he did it again and again and again. And he said, look, I've got this idea. How would you like me to build one of these for you? And in 1919, when they were handing out awards for inventors, for military inventors and so forth, the committee turned around and said, because they never actually took him up. They never took him up on his idea. But in 1919, they looked at his designs again and said, you know what? If we'd picked up that idea in 1912, it would have been so much better.
Can you imagine they go, oh yeah, wow, you really solved all these problems.
It took them a long time. He'd already done it back in 1912. Mm-hmm. But the only thing I want to talk about him, because he was an Australian, and all I can think about to myself is, and just going with the normal Australian culture of the time, was he came up with this brilliant idea. He approached the British saying, would you like me to do this for you? And they said, well, you're just a colonial. We're not going to listen to you. I'm
going to speak on behalf of people who work in government here. The public are constantly sending their brilliant ideas in. And a bit like Winston Churchill, yes, there may well be a really good idea in there. But, you know, when you're being deluged with so many bad ideas, it gets really hard to look for the good ones in amongst it, you know? It's a bit like saying, oh, we can point to this warning and that warning that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. And it's like, yeah, you're right. That bit of paper said it was going to happen, and that bit of paper said it was happening. Now, have a look at the enormous pile of papers that was in the in tray of the analyst who was supposed to be, you know, making that judgment.
But he was told, mate, the Palmers won't listen to you. Maybe you should go talk to the Germans. And he said, nah, those guys are a bunch of wankers. And
Germans are never going to take armour on.
So he did not show his designs to the Germans before patriotic reasons. So it was a good thing. All right, but basically he still got almost £1,000 reward at the end of the war in 1919 to say, well done on your good thinking. Sorry we didn't take it up.
Yeah.
And £1,000 at that time, that's
a lot of money.
That's a huge amount of money.
And, just once again, Australians, turns out, have invented everything.
It's not a real war until we take Damascus,
well,
mate.
that's a different... For the American audience, as it happens in both world wars, Australian troops did take Damascus.
So we're
little known fact.
we're waiting for Syria to just... Wow.
Wait till it kicks off, yeah.
That'll be scary. Anyway, the Renault FT17. All right, 3,000 of these built.
The Victory Tank.
The Victory Tank. So for the Americans, that's your first tank built by the French.
Well, I mean, the Americans built something like 5,000 Renault FTs in the US as well. But it was the tank design that the US Army picked up when it entered the war. And there's a lot of really interesting books about the US Army's entry into the war, but sadly, every general approaching industrial warfare in the 20th century said, the spirit of the bayonet and esprit de corps, that's all we need. Everyone's just too soft. And then they find out that, no, you need logistics and planning and artillery support and air support and then armour and communications and and being brave just stopped being enough some time ago. But yeah.
Yep. It all became, the word computer, it's all about the artilleryman.
Yeah. Literally. So the Renault FT is also... There have been times when we've been debating doing a vehicle for this show where we go, be interesting, but it's not really a tank. And part of what defines a tank is a tracked vehicle, an armoured vehicle, and a vehicle with a turret. And everything up until the Renault FT did not have a turret and thus did not actually qualify as a tank and can only really be considered a tank because it was called a tank and it became what we think of as a tank. So it's in the lineage and thus sort of gets a pass, even though by the modern definition doesn't really qualify.
So the Renault FT, an 8-ton vehicle, so much lighter than these huge behemoths running around. 3-person crew, driver, a gunner, and an engineer. It had a turret, and in the turret they could either have a machine gun or I think they got up to a 37mm gun, which
had a lot of armor-piercing poke for the era.
Yeah, that was so it could move, it could get around, and
The 7-ton load is really, really important because it meant it was portable on the back of trucks. They didn't need to rely on railway lines.
Yeah, it was not expected to cross trenches because it was so small. All right, so it was about 3 meters long.
It did have a chunk of metal that stuck out the back, which was designed so that if it tried to drive over a trench, the back end could fall in, and this bit of metal would catch the back of it, and then the tracks at the front could drag it out of the trench. Now, how well that would have worked, I'd love to see some video of the time, and sadly, video of World War One is short on the ground.
Yep.
But it it would have been interesting watching. Obviously, they had enough faith in it that they kept producing quite a heavy chunk of metal on the back of the tank to keep using, so it must have had some value.
So, yeah, great big front drive wheel, some of which were wooden.
But, importantly, the engine was in the back.
Yes, so when you shot at it from the front, you couldn't hit the engine.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Israelis carry on about how great their Merkavas are because they put the engine in the front and it stops bullets for them, but that's not really what engines are for.
No, it's... great armour, and you can replace them and so forth, and you don't lose your crew if you've got limited numbers. But
the point was, every tank except the Israeli Merkavas. When I say every tank, yes, I'm sure there's something out there.
There's thousands.
Almost every tank, the vast majority of tanks since the Renault FT have followed its basic layout of engine in the back, turret with the main armament in it, and it looked recognisably like what you'd think of as a tank.
Yes. And it was used up until 1948 in the Arab-Israeli War.
Everywhere, yeah.
So it was so during the all between the wars, between 1 and 2, it was deployed lots of different places for little colonial wars, and through the Second World War, which didn't get much love with because it just got blown the shit out of. But
It's one of those situations where, against other good modern gear, something might be terrible, but any tank is better than no tank.
It's only until you're facing RPGs, in which you weren't a lot of the time. But yeah, as I said, 1948. That's a bit of longevity.
It's a long run. I mean, Centurion probably exceeds it, but there aren't many.
No.
Do, particularly because it was so revolutionary and right back at the dawn, only a couple of years after the very first.
And this is where, as I was saying before, the difference between the British and the French approach, where the British said we're going to have one committee, we're going to decide on one thing, and that's the only thing we're going to go with. Whereas the French said, all right, everybody go out and make their own tanks, and from that we'll figure out the best one, and we'll go with that. And that's what they eventually came up with.
You can come horribly unstuck with that approach because you have to have a concept of operations. Well, you don't have to. Many armies have fought without them. But it's generally considered to be good practice to have a concept of operations and to buy the kit and do the training based around a valid concept of operations. But I grant you that in 1916, when you're trying to figure out how you're going to get out of the mud of northern France, you don't have time to worry too much about that sort of thing. You just need to get stuff and throw it at the enemy.
All right. Is there anything else we want to talk about? There are some other French tanks that were built. They all fell in ditches because they were too front heavy, and there was a lot of talk about having a 75mm gun as the way to win the war. And you know what? All those tanks fell in ditches, and mechanical issues did not succeed for them. You didn't get any super heavies or heavy tanks on either side, and so it basically ended up with what you call a medium tank of the Mark IVs and the light tanks of the FT-17s.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that the limitations of the internal combustion engines at the time,
and your ground pressure, and
if you've only got 120 horsepower, 600 horsepower is where tanks start to get interesting. And up to, I think today, good modern tanks are around 1,200 horsepower. But 100 horsepower is not enough.
No, that's your infantry tank moving at 4 miles an hour, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 100 horsepower is a good motorcycle, but... yeah, it's...
So the invention of the tanks happened during World War One in order to break through the trenches and the barbed wire, and because nobody wanted to walk through no man's land, and eventually the concept evolved and evolved, and it's still evolving.
I think it's worth noting, though, that what won the war in the end was the tank being used as part of doctrines of combined arms warfare. So the planes were doing things. Signals intelligence was doing things. The amount of technology that was assembled by the end of the First World War. They were using triangulation to do counter battery fire, so that the sound of the enemy guns was betraying their position, and return fire was coming in on it. And being able to do creeping barrages of artillery, so your infantry could advance.
The tanks would be advancing behind the artillery, and the infantry would be advancing behind the tanks.
Yeah, but getting all that scheduling working and getting everyone doing the right things at the right time is unbelievably hard and takes years and years of serious effort and training to get to the point you can do that. That just doesn't just happen. When it does just happen, it's because people have done the work. It's one of my bugbears is I feel like, oh, this has just happened. And it's like, I guarantee you someone worked really hard to make it happen. But the tank was a very important part of that effort to win the war and deny the Germans space to counter. There was nothing left that they could do at the end. And in a way, it's a tragedy that Germany fell apart internally so dramatically in November 1918 that their armies remained largely undefeated in the field, even though all the preconditions of their defeat had been established. If the war had gone on into 1919, the German army would have undoubtedly been defeated in the field.
Yes.
But it's also worth noting the Navy was mutinying in late 1918. The cities were revolting and setting up independent governments. I mean, Germany was completely falling apart. And that's where, unfortunately, the Nazis got in with their myth-making about how the army was never defeated and that sort of stuff.
But we don't don't want to finish talking about the Nazis. We want to talk about land ships.
Land ships.
All right. So as I was saying before, it was Leonardo da Vinci who came up with the concept of a great big armoured system around a body of troops that would slowly advance and break the Terios, I think it was, which was the... Tercio. Yes. The pikemen, the...
Pike and shot,
Pike and shot, and the infantry of that had been dominating European battles for 300 years, I supposedly read, but I don't know about that. I didn't think it was that long. But
200
anyway.
for the Tercio. Had a good run.
But, so he was drawing it up in the 16th century, and 400 years later, somebody said, oh, now we have the internal combustion engine, we can actually carry out his vision.
Yeah.
How great is that?
We got there, folks. Not that modern warfare is particularly great, but
No.
look, I really want to thank everyone who's listened all the way through. We passed this week our 1000th download of the show, which is quite exciting. It's takes small steps to make these things. So thank you to everyone who has listened along the way. Do let us know in the comments. I know the M4 got you all very excited, and I look forward to hearing about all the ways in which we're wrong. So please do let us know.
Thank you.